September 1944, Gothic Line, northern Italy. The Germans had turned the Apennine Mountains into a fortress unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. For 4 months, they had been building. They carved 2,376 machine gun positions into the rock. They positioned 479 anti-tank guns on every ridge and hilltop. They laid mines by the thousands. They knew the Allies were coming, and they were ready. The Allied commanders had a problem. Their tanks were useless here. Tanks were built for flat ground, for charging across open fields. But these mountains were steep and narrow. The roads twisted like snakes. One wrong turn and a 50-ton Sherman tank would tumble off a cliff. The Germans knew this. They waited in their mountain positions and smiled. The numbers told a grim story. 23 times, Allied tank units had tried to break through. 23 times, they failed. The casualty rates were brutal. For every 100 men who attacked, 40 never came back. The math was simple and terrible. At this rate, the Allies would run out of soldiers before they ran out of mountains. British tank commanders held meeting after meeting. They studied their maps. They counted their losses. The answer was always the same. Tanks do not belong in mountains. Everyone knew this. It was written in every training manual. Mountains were for infantry, for men on foot, carrying rifles. Tanks needed open space. Tanks needed room to move. That was the doctrine. That was the rule. But the Allied generals had no choice. They needed to break through. Winter was coming. If they did not push through these mountains before the snow fell, they would be stuck until spring. The Germans would have 6 more months to build their defenses even stronger. So the orders came down. Send in the tanks. Send them into the mountains. Hope for the best. This is where the 5th Canadian Armoured Division entered the story. The Germans had files on every Allied unit. They knew which divisions to fear and which to ignore. When German intelligence officers saw the Canadians were coming, they laughed. These were not hardened veterans. These were boys, fresh from training camps in Canada. Their average age was just 22 years old. Most had been farmers before the war. Some had cut timber in the forests. Others had worked in shops and factories. Very few had ever seen real combat. The German reports called them colonial amateurs playing soldier. The British commanders were not laughing, but they were not hopeful either. A British general visited the Canadian camp in early September. He looked at the young faces. He saw their inexperience. He shook his head and walked away. Later, he told his staff that sending the Canadians into the Gothic Line was a waste of good equipment. The tanks would be destroyed. The boys would die. That was all. But the British general had not met Major General Bert Hoffmeister. Hoffmeister was 39 years old, which made him ancient compared to his soldiers. Before the war, he had not been a career military man. He had run a business. He had been part of the militia, the part-time soldiers who trained on weekends. The professional officers looked down on militiamen. They were not real soldiers, not in the eyes of the British staff officers who had spent their whole lives in uniform. Hoffmeister did not care what they thought. He had been given an impossible job, and he intended to do it. While other commanders complained about the mountains, Hoffmeister studied them. He drove to the front lines. He walked the ridges. He looked at where the German guns were placed. He looked at where his tanks would have to go. He spent hours staring at the terrain through his binoculars. The German positions were strong, that was clear. But Hoffmeister saw something else. He saw that the Germans had prepared for a traditional tank attack. They expected the Allies to send their armor in large formations, 12 or 15 tanks rolling together down the valleys. Every German gun was aimed at the valleys. Every mine was laid on the roads. The Germans had built their defense based on how tanks were supposed to be used. Hoffmeister sat in his tent one night in mid-September. His maps were spread across the table. The other officers had gone to sleep. Outside, he could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire. The battle was always there, always waiting. He traced his finger along the mountain ridges on the map. Then he stopped. His finger rested on a hilltop. From that hilltop, a tank could fire down into the German positions. But to get there, the tank would have to leave the road. It would have to climb. It would have to move slowly, carefully, like infantry. The idea was absurd. Tanks did not climb mountains. Tanks did not creep along ridges. Tanks charged. That was their purpose. That was how they won battles. Every tank manual said so. Every instructor had taught this. Even the Germans believed it. Their entire defense was built on this one simple truth. But what if that truth was wrong? What if tanks could do something different? What if instead of using tanks the way everyone expected, the Canadians used them in a way no one had ever tried? Hoffmeister looked at his maps again. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. The Germans feared tanks because tanks were powerful. But they did not fear tanks in the mountains because they knew tanks could not fight there. So what would happen if tanks did fight there, but fought in a completely new way? Hoffmeister made his decision that night. He would break every rule in the book. He would make his tanks fight like ghosts, appearing where they should not be, striking from positions the Germans thought were impossible. The British would call him crazy. His own officers might doubt him. But he had seen enough failed attacks. He had counted enough dead. Someone had to try something different. It might as well be the amateur from the militia and his division of young Canadian farmers. Hoffmeister called his officers together the next morning. The sun was just coming up over the mountains. The men gathered around a table covered with maps. They looked tired. They had seen too many battles already. They expected another speech about courage and duty. Instead, Hoffmeister told them to forget everything they had learned about tank warfare. The standard way to use tanks was simple. You gathered 12 or 15 tanks together in one formation. You picked a target, you charged. The tanks rolled forward side by side, firing as they went. The noise alone was supposed to terrify the enemy. The sight of all that armor moving together was supposed to break their will to fight. This was how every army used tanks. This was how you won with armor. Hoffmeister said no, not anymore, not here. In these mountains, he explained, large formations were death traps. The Germans could see them coming from miles away. Every anti-tank gun would be ready. Every position would fire at once. The tanks would be sitting ducks, rolling down predictable roads. Instead, Hoffmeister wanted his tanks to operate in groups of just 3 vehicles. 3 tanks working together, moving independently, finding their own routes up the mountains. The officers stared at him. One captain spoke up. "Sir," he said, "3 tanks cannot defend themselves. If they run into enemy armor, they will be outnumbered. If they need support, there will be no one close enough to help. 3 tanks alone in the mountains would be vulnerable." "Exactly," Hoffmeister replied. "The Germans will think the same thing. They will not expect us to split up our strength. They will keep watching the valleys for our main force, while our small groups climb the ridges above them. We will not charge down roads. We will appear on hilltops. We will fire down at them from positions they think tanks cannot reach. Then we will move before they can respond." He laid out the rest of his plan. The tanks would not operate alone. Infantry squads would move with each 3-tank group. Not whole battalions of infantry supporting whole battalions of tanks. Just small teams. 10 or 12 soldiers working directly with 3 tank crews. They would talk to each other constantly. The infantry would scout ahead. The tanks would provide the firepower. Together, they would move like hunters, not like an army. This was a 75% reduction in unit size. Instead of commanding 300 tanks as one massive hammer, Hoffmeister was breaking his division into 100 tiny blades. Each blade would cut its own path through the German defenses. The British heard about this plan and sent officers to stop it. A colonel arrived at the Canadian headquarters on September 12th. He was furious. This was not how armor divisions worked. This violated every principle of concentrated force. If Hoffmeister scattered his tanks across the mountains, the Germans would destroy them one group at a time. It was suicide. It was madness. It would not be permitted. But Hoffmeister had an ally. Lieutenant General Tommy Burns commanded the entire Canadian Corps. Burns was quiet and thoughtful, the opposite of the loud British officers. He had read Hoffmeister's plan carefully. He had studied the same maps. He had seen the same casualty reports from previous attacks. Burns made a decision. He told the British colonel that the Canadians would try their new tactics. If it failed, Burns would take the blame. If it worked, everyone would benefit. Burns did more than give permission. He allocated 300 extra Sherman tanks to Hoffmeister's division. These were not ordinary Shermans. Military engineers had modified them specifically for mountain fighting. They shortened the barrels by 8 inches so the guns would not hit rocks on narrow trails. They reinforced the suspension so the tanks could handle steep climbs. They added extra storage racks that held 40% more ammunition. Each tank could fight longer without resupplying. On September 15, 1944, near the town of Rimini, Hoffmeister tested his theory. He sent 9 groups into the hills, 27 tanks total, spread across a 5-mile front. The Germans watched the valleys and waited for the main assault. It never came. Instead, just after dawn, German forward positions began reporting something impossible. Tanks were appearing on the ridges above them. Tanks were firing from hilltops. Tanks were in places where tanks should not exist. The German gunners had aimed their weapons to cover the roads and valleys. Now they had to turn their guns upward, an awkward angle. Some guns could not elevate high enough to hit the Canadian tanks on the high ground. The Canadians fired down at the German positions. The shells fell almost straight down into the trenches and bunkers. The Germans had never trained for this. Their defenses were built backwards. For 6 days, the small Canadian groups pushed forward. They moved slowly but steadily. Each 3-tank team picked its own route. When they found a good firing position, they stopped and called for infantry support. The infantry moved up and cleared any German soldiers hiding in the rocks. Then the tanks moved forward again. It was not glamorous. It was not fast, but it worked. By September 21st, the Canadians had advanced 18 kilometers. Other Allied units in the same area had spent 3 weeks fighting for 3 kilometers. The math was stunning. The Canadians were moving 6 times faster than anyone else, and their casualties were lower. Instead of losing 40 men out of every 100, the Canadians lost 12 out of every 100. It was still terrible. War always was, but it was less terrible than before. Field Marshal Kesselring commanded all German forces in Italy. His staff officers brought him reports about the Canadian advance. Kesselring read the reports twice. He did not believe them. "Armor cannot operate effectively in mountain terrain," he said. "It is tactically impossible." His officers assured him the reports were accurate. Canadian tanks were climbing mountains. Canadian tanks were using infantry tactics. Canadian tanks were winning. Kesselring sent a message to all his commanders. "Find out what these Canadians are doing," he ordered. "Study their methods. Prepare countermeasures." But inside, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt worried. The Allies had found something new. They had changed the rules. If this spread to other divisions, if other Allied units learned these tactics, the entire German defensive strategy would collapse. Back in the Canadian camp, Hoffmeister gathered his officers again. The test had worked. The small unit tactics had proven themselves. Now it was time to expand. Hoffmeister had more than 400 tanks in his division. He would split them all into these small hunting groups. He would spread them across 40 kilometers of front. The Germans would not know where to look. They would not know where the next attack would come from. And most importantly, they would never again be able to assume that tanks belonged only on flat ground. The amateur militia officer and his division of young farmers had just rewritten the rulebook for armored warfare. What Hoffmeister had proven in those 6 days near Rimini was about to become a nightmare for every German commander in Italy. The numbers told a story that was hard to ignore. Before Hoffmeister's tactics, Allied armor in the Gothic Line advanced an average of 0.3 of a kilometer each day. That meant it took more than 3 days to move just 1 kilometer forward. At that pace, the war would last forever. But the 5th Canadian Armoured Division was now averaging 2.1 kilometers per day. That was 7 times faster. 700% improvement. The difference between crawling and running. By early October 1944, Hoffmeister deployed his full strength across the front. He had 427 tanks operational. He spread them across a 40-kilometer stretch of mountains. That meant roughly 1 tank for every 100 meters of front line. But the Germans could never predict where those tanks would actually be. The Canadians did not stay in neat lines. They moved constantly, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the hills. The German commanders quickly noticed something was different. Reports flooded into headquarters. Canadian armor spotted on Monte Battaglia. Canadian tanks firing from positions near San Clemente. 3 Canadian Shermans destroyed a supply convoy near Cesena. Each report described small groups, never more than a handful of tanks, always in unexpected places. On October 8th, a German officer sent a warning message to all units in his sector. The message was captured later by Allied intelligence. It read, "The Canadian armored units do not behave according to doctrine. They infiltrate like infantry but strike with armor weight." Traditional anti-tank defenses are proving insufficient. This was a remarkable admission. The Germans were famous for their tactical skill. They had invented modern tank warfare. Now they were warning their own troops that they did not know how to fight these Canadians. The German army had a standard response to Allied tank attacks. When they spotted a concentration of enemy armor, they brought in their own panzers to counterattack. German tanks were often better than Allied tanks in direct combat. A German Panther or Tiger could destroy a Sherman at long range. But this only worked if you could find the enemy tanks grouped together. The Canadian tactic of spreading out in small groups made the German counter-strategy useless. The Battle of the Savio River in October proved this perfectly. The Savio was not a large river, but its banks were steep and muddy. The Germans expected the Canadians to mass their tanks for a traditional river crossing. They positioned 35 panzers in concealed positions, ready to slaughter the Canadians when they tried to cross. The German plan was sound. It should have worked. But the Canadians did not mass their tanks. Instead, 12 separate three-tank groups approached the river at different points, spread across 8 kilometers. Each group found its own crossing point. Some waded through shallow areas. Others used small bridges that the Germans had ignored because they were too narrow for large formations. The German panzers waited for the main attack that never came. By the time they realized the Canadians were already across the river in a dozen places, it was too late. The small Canadian groups were everywhere at once. When German tanks moved to engage one group, 2 other groups would fire at them from different angles. The Germans lost 31 tanks trying to stop the crossing. The Canadians lost 4. It was not even close. The German crews were brave and their tanks were powerful, but they could not fight an enemy they could not pin down. The sound of battle in those mountain valleys was unlike anything else in the war. The rumble of Sherman engines echoed off the rocky slopes, bouncing back and forth, until it seemed like the entire mountain range was filled with tanks. Crews learned to operate in near silence when moving. Hand signals replaced radio chatter. The less noise they made, the harder they were to locate. Then, when they opened fire, the noise was deafening. The crack of the 75mm guns reverberated through the narrow passes. The smell of cordite mixed with the morning fog that clung to the valleys. Spent shell casings clinked against rocks as they tumbled down slopes. The crews developed their own routines. Tank commanders learned to read the terrain like farmers reading soil. They could tell which slopes would support a Sherman's weight and which would not. Drivers learned to feel the ground through the tank's controls, sensing when the earth beneath them was solid rock or loose gravel. Loaders worked in cramped turrets, sweating even in October's cool air, feeding shells into the guns as fast as the gunners could fire them. German soldiers began calling the Canadians Geisterwerke, which meant ghost works. The name spread through the German ranks quickly. Some German officers reported that their troops refused to hold certain defensive positions if intelligence suggested the 5th Canadian Armoured was operating nearby. This was extraordinary. These were Wehrmacht soldiers, among the most disciplined troops in any army. But even they had limits. Fighting an enemy you could not predict, who appeared from impossible directions and vanished before you could respond, wore down morale faster than any bombardment. Other Allied commanders watched what was happening and tried to copy the Canadian tactics. The British 1st Armoured Division attempted to use similar dispersed formations in late October. It did not work. Their crews had been trained for years in traditional tank tactics. They could not simply forget that training overnight. When they split into small groups, they became confused and disorganized. They lacked the practice and the instinct that the Canadians had developed. The British experiment lasted 3 days before they went back to conventional methods. The Americans tried a different approach. They kept their tanks in larger formations, but gave them more independence to choose their own routes. This worked better than the British attempt, but still not as well as the Canadian method. The problem was not just the tactics, it was the mindset. Hoffmeister had built his entire division around the idea of small units working independently. Every officer, every tank commander, every driver had trained for this. They trusted each other to operate without constant orders from above. That trust could not be created quickly. By November 1944, Allied intelligence collected documents from captured German positions. One report from a German general described the Canadian division's impact. Enemy armor operates with unusual flexibility. It read, "Standard defensive measures designed for conventional tank formations are ineffective. Units must be prepared for armor attack from any direction, including elevated positions previously considered tank-proof. The Canadians had done something that rarely happens in war. They had forced the enemy to change their entire defensive strategy. The Germans had to spread their anti-tank guns more widely. They had to position observers on hilltops to watch for tanks approaching from above. They had to keep larger reserves ready to respond to attacks that could come from anywhere. All of this weakened their overall defensive strength. Troops and weapons that could have been concentrated in strong points had to be scattered to guard against the Canadian threat. The price of this success was not small. Canadian crews still died. Tanks still burned. War remained war. But the mathematics of survival had shifted in their favor. For every kilometer they advanced, fewer men died than before. For every objective they captured, fewer tanks were destroyed. The young farmers and lumberjacks from Canada had learned to fight in mountains that experts said were impossible for armor. And in learning, they had made the Germans fear them. When the war ended in May 1945, military analysts from every Allied nation gathered to study what had happened in the Italian mountains. They collected reports, interviewed officers, and reviewed battle maps. The data they compiled was remarkable. The 5th Canadian Armoured Division had suffered 30% fewer casualties than comparable units fighting in similar terrain. At the same time, they had achieved advance rates that were 180% faster. These were not small differences. These were the kinds of numbers that changed how armies thought about warfare. The analysts wrote their reports and sent them up the chain of command. The conclusions were clear. The dispersed, small unit tactics that Hoffmeister had pioneered were superior to traditional armored doctrine when fighting in restricted terrain. Mountains, forests, urban areas, any place where large formations could not maneuver freely. These new methods worked better. The reports recommended that all Allied armies adopt similar approaches for future conflicts. But adoption was slow. The British Army, with its centuries of tradition, was reluctant to change its training manuals based on what a Canadian militia officer had done. The Americans were more interested in the lessons they had learned in France and Germany, where the terrain was flatter and traditional tank tactics had worked well. Only the Canadians themselves fully embraced what their division had accomplished. They made Hoffmeister's tactics the foundation of their armored training programs. Hoffmeister himself wanted nothing to do with fame or recognition. When the war ended, he was 40 years old. He had spent 6 years in uniform. He had led men through some of the worst fighting of the Italian campaign. He had seen too many young soldiers die. He went home to Canada and returned to civilian life as quickly as the army would let him. He took a position in business and rarely spoke about the war. The British awarded medals to many of their commanders. Historians wrote books about their victories. Hoffmeister received some recognition, but nothing compared to the British generals who had commanded larger forces. He did not seem to mind. When reporters asked him about his innovative tactics, he gave brief answers and changed the subject. He had done his job. The war was over. That was enough for him. In the decades after the war, something interesting happened. Military strategists around the world kept returning to the Italian campaign. They studied what the 5th Canadian Armoured Division had done, not because it was the biggest battle or the most famous victory, but because it represented a different way of thinking about armored warfare. By the 1960s, NATO began incorporating elements of Hoffmeister's tactics into its official mountain warfare doctrine. Tanks operating in small, independent groups, close coordination between armor and infantry at the squad level, using terrain for protection rather than speed for survival. These ideas became standard practice. The Israeli Defense Forces studied the Canadian operations extensively. Israel's geography included mountains and narrow valleys, terrain similar to northern Italy. Israeli tank commanders retranslated reports of the 5th Canadian Armoured Division's battles. They practiced the same small unit tactics. When Israel fought its wars in the 1960s and 1970s, observers noted the similarity between Israeli armored tactics and what the Canadians had done decades earlier in Italy. The connection was not accidental. The Israelis had learned from the Canadians, even if few people realized it. Military academies began teaching the Italian campaign as an example of tactical innovation. West Point in America, Sandhurst in Britain, and staff colleges in a dozen other countries included case studies of Hoffmeister's methods. Young officers learned that doctrine was important, but so was the ability to adapt when doctrine did not fit the situation. The lesson was not that tanks should always operate in small groups. The lesson was that commanders should think critically about whether established methods were appropriate for their specific circumstances. Hoffmeister lived until 1999. He was 94 years old when he died. By then, the world had changed completely. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. New types of warfare had emerged. But military theorists were still writing about what he had done in 1944. Some of them sent him copies of their papers. He read them politely and filed them away. He never thought of himself as a great innovator. He had simply solved a problem using common sense. But the 5th Canadian Armoured Division's legacy was bigger than just new tactics or training manuals. The broader lesson of their story went beyond military tactics. It was a lesson about human nature and how we approach problems. Organizations, whether armies or businesses or governments, develop ways of doing things. These methods become tradition. They get written into manuals. People teach them to new members. Over time, everyone assumes these methods are the only way, or at least the best way. Then someone comes along who has not been fully absorbed into the tradition. Maybe they are an outsider, like Hoffmeister with his militia background. Maybe they are young and have not learned to stop questioning yet. Maybe they simply have the courage to say, "What if we are wrong about this?" That person looks at the same problem everyone else has been struggling with and sees it differently. Not because they are smarter, but because they are willing to question assumptions that everyone else takes for granted. The Germans in 1944 were not stupid. They were professional soldiers with excellent training and good equipment. But they assumed tanks would always be used in certain ways because tanks had always been used in those ways. The British commanders were not fools either. They followed doctrine because doctrine usually worked. But both sides had stopped asking whether their assumptions were correct for this specific situation. Hoffmeister asked that question. The answer changed everything. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers succeeded in building an airplane partly because they were bicycle mechanics, not trained engineers who knew it was impossible. Entrepreneurs disrupt established industries because they do not accept that things must be done the old way. Scientists make breakthroughs when they question theories that everyone else considers settled fact. The pattern is always the same. Someone refuses to accept conventional wisdom. Someone asks, "But what if?" Modern militaries still face the same fundamental challenge. They prepare for future wars based on lessons from past wars. They develop doctrine based on what worked before. But the next war is never exactly like the last one. The terrain is different. The technology is different. The enemy is different. Commanders must balance respect for proven methods with willingness to adapt when circumstances demand it. This is not easy. It requires judgment, courage, and the humility to admit that you might be wrong. The story of the 5th Canadian Armoured Division teaches us that innovation is not about being the strongest or having the most resources. The Canadians did not win because they had better tanks. They won because they had better thinking. They looked at an impossible situation and refused to accept that it was impossible. They broke the rules because the rules were not working. And in breaking them, they created new rules that worked better. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the biggest weapons or the most experience. Sometimes it is the one willing to rewrite the rulebook while everyone else is still memorizing the old one. That willingness to think differently, to question what everyone knows to be true, that is what the Germans feared. Not the Canadian tanks, the Canadian thinking.